I first noticed Miriam Barnett, Karen, as locals whispered, on the day I moved into my new home in the quiet suburb of Lakecrest Heights. The neighborhood was everything I wanted for a fresh start. Manicured lawns, picturesque picket fences, and a string of tall maples that shaded the sidewalks. There was an almost storybook charm to it. I was unloading boxes from the back of my pickup truck when I heard a sharp, authoritative voice behind me. Turning, I caught sight of a woman in her mid-50s, her graying auburn hair swept back neatly from her forehead, standing with her arms folded across her chest. Dressed in a crisp button-down blouse and pressed beige slacks, she looked like she was heading to an office job. But if rumors were true, she worked from home, a job that gave her ample time to patrol the neighborhood. "Hello," she said, cool eyes scanning the boxes stacked in my driveway. "You must be the new neighbor." I smiled and extended my hand. "That's right. I'm Sam Merrick. Nice to meet you." She gave my hand a quick, perfunctory shake. "Miriam Barnett," she replied, but the corners of her mouth never lifted into a smile. "I'm the president of the Lakecrest Heights Homeowners Association, but everyone around here calls me Ms. Barnett or ma'am." Behind her, I could see a petite woman with curly blonde hair peering curiously from her porch 2 houses down. Another couple in workout gear quickly averted their eyes when they realized I was looking in their direction. This entire introduction felt uncomfortably staged, like Ms. Barnett had orchestrated the perfect moment to introduce herself and to stake her claim on my property, if only symbolically. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Ms. Barnett," I said in my best neighborly tone. "Lakecrest Heights is a wonderful place," she told me matter-of-factly. "We take pride in our well-kept lawns, our pristine streets, and especially our community guidelines. I've placed a packet in your mailbox that outlines all the rules. We expect everyone to comply with them." I remembered reading about a homeowners association in the listing, but it had seemed fairly ordinary. Once you've seen one HOA, you've seen them all, right? There are usually rules about house paint colors, front yard decorations, and noise ordinances, all fairly standard. But standing in front of Ms. Barnett, who seemed determined to scrutinize my every move, I felt an unexpected twinge of nervousness. "Of course, I'll look them over carefully," I promised, forcing a friendly smile. "Very well," she said primly, glancing at the watch strapped around her wrist. "I'll let you get settled, but I'll be checking in within the week to be sure everything is in order." With that, Ms. Barnett turned on her heel and marched away, her posture impeccable, her gaze lingering on my truck for a moment longer than felt normal. I exhaled and shook my head. Even in those first few minutes, I had the feeling this was not the last time Ms. Barnett, Karen, would make her presence known. True to her word, a thick envelope sat inside my mailbox. Tearing it open, I discovered a hefty set of documents outlining the Lakecrest Heights regulations. They covered everything from the maximum height of fence posts, 3 feet, to the required type of mailbox, standard black metal with white lettering. There were separate sections on how many bird feeders were allowed, 2 per lot, what days of the week you could mow your lawn, not on Sundays before 10 a.m., and even specific guidelines for what kind of decorative flags could be displayed on national holidays. I sighed, flipping through page after page. I'd heard jokes about militant HOAs, but this was next level. Yet, I rationalized, I might be able to tolerate these rules if it meant living in such a peaceful environment. The streets here were wide, the kids safe to play. Maybe a strict HOA was just the price of a clean, safe neighborhood. A couple of days later, while I was unpacking the last of the cardboard boxes, my doorbell rang. Answering, I found Ms. Barnett. Again, that stoic expression and precisely folded arms. "Hello, Sam," she said, dispensing with formality about my surname. "I'm doing my routine check-in." I motioned for her to step inside, though I nearly regretted it. My living room was still a battlefield of half-empty boxes. She surveyed everything with a slight curl of her lip. "So, have you had a chance to read through all the guidelines?" "I did," I replied. "They're quite thorough." She nodded, satisfied. Then, with an unblinking stare, she said, "We pride ourselves on thoroughness." There was an awkward pause. "Anything else I can do for you, Ms. Barnett?" I finally asked. "Oh, nothing in particular. Just wanted to make sure you understood that we take them all very seriously. We can't have the aesthetic of our neighborhood compromised by lax standards. Imagine if we let everyone do as they please. Lawns overgrown, mismatched fencing, tacky yard gnomes." Not on my watch. She gave a crisp nod and left. As I closed the door, I exhaled a sigh of relief. It seemed I had passed that day's inspection. For the first 2 weeks, life in Lakecrest Heights was pleasantly uneventful. The neighbors, though somewhat guarded, appeared mostly friendly, especially after they realized I wasn't going to give them trouble. I began to suspect that Ms. Barnett, ironically, was the biggest source of tension around here. Then came the first real sign of conflict, the day I installed my outdoor lighting. I've always been a fan of subtle path lights and warm porch fixtures. The little solar-powered stakes that line the walkway from my driveway to my front door brought me a sense of calm. I like to see my path lit up at night, especially when I arrived home late. No sooner had I finished hammering the stakes into the ground, adjusting the small solar panels, than I heard the clearing of a throat. I turned, somewhat prepared to see Ms. Barnett marching up to me in her usual posture of authority. But it wasn't her. This time, it was another neighbor, a lean man in his 40s named Carlos, who lived across the street. He gave me a friendly wave and trotted over. "Hey," he said quietly. "I don't mean to pry, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Ms. Barnett, Karen, will probably come down on you about those lights." I frowned. "But they're the standard solar garden lights, right? They don't violate any rules." Carlos shrugged. "Technically, no, but she's been on this kick about energy-saving measures, about not letting the neighborhood waste electricity. She's also the one who complains about light pollution. She's suggested curfews on certain types of outdoor lighting, especially after 8 p.m. She'll definitely say something." I bit back a groan. "But they're solar. They don't use any grid electricity." Carlos gave me a sympathetic grin. "She's not always rational. Just thought I'd warn you, so you have time to figure out how to handle her." I patted Carlos on the shoulder. "Thanks for the tip. Let's see what happens." Sure enough, the next evening I came home around 8:30, and the lights were glowing softly along my walkway. It was pretty, nothing bright or glaring, just a gentle illumination. A couple of neighbors even stopped to comment how nice it looked. But not Ms. Barnett. From behind the curtains of her living room, I spotted her silhouette. I could almost feel her eyes boring into my yard. I was certain she would soon make her displeasure known. The following Monday, a new notice was pinned to the community board near the mailboxes. An emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled for that Wednesday. All homeowners were strongly encouraged to attend. I arrived at the small community clubhouse, a modest single-room building with folding chairs and a lectern, and found it filled with at least 20 neighbors. The chatter inside suggested that many of them suspected this meeting was about Ms. Barnett's latest proposal. At exactly 7 p.m., Ms. Barnett strode to the front of the room and tapped a tiny gavel against the lectern. Her voice carried easily across the small space. "Good evening, Lakecrest Heights. Thank you for attending this emergency session. I won't take much of your time," she began crisply. "As you know, our community is proud of its environmentally conscious stance. However, we must do more. Recently, I've observed a troubling trend. More and more residents leaving their outdoor lights on past 8 p.m. A few heads turned toward me, and I fought the urge to shrink into my seat. I could guess who the culprit was in Ms. Barnett's mind, even though I knew I wasn't the only one. "I believe strongly," she went on, "that we should adopt a neighborhood-wide mandatory shutoff at 8 p.m. for all non-essential lighting. This will help reduce our carbon footprint, keep our neighborhood from looking like a Vegas strip, and, most importantly, ensure we remain the shining example of modern, eco-friendly living." Her gaze moved around the room, challenging anyone to disagree. One man in the corner raised a tentative hand. "But Ms. Barnett, some of us have late-night shifts, or we come home after dark. Don't you think it's a safety hazard to walk to the door without any lighting?" Another neighbor chimed in. "And what about kids who might step on something sharp if they're playing outside in the summer evenings?" Ms. Barnett pressed her lips together in a thin line. "I understand your concerns. However, I propose we keep only necessary security lights on. Those must be motion-activated and pointed downward to minimize light pollution. Any decorative or constant lighting, especially path lights, should be turned off by 8 p.m. sharp." A murmur spread through the crowd. A short, older woman with bright pink lipstick named Linda stood up. "This rule seems a bit drastic, Ms. Barnett. We already have guidelines about brightness and wattage. Aren't we overcomplicating things?" Ms. Barnett's face hardened. "Drastic times call for drastic measures. Our neighborhood is proud to lead by example, and I, for one, will not stand by while we revert to wasteful habits." She looked right at me when she said that. The meeting ended with Ms. Barnett announcing that a vote would be held in 1 week. Meanwhile, the official stance of the HOA board, which included Ms. Barnett and 2 individuals who rarely contradicted her, was to enforce an informal 8 p.m. shutoff, strongly encouraging compliance. I left the meeting feeling unsettled and more than a little irritated. Her words about not turning this place into a Vegas strip seemed aimed directly at me. The truth was, my solar lights were dim, environmentally friendly, and hardly a nuisance. It was all personal with Ms. Barnett. The question was, why me? Over the next week, I talked to a few neighbors to get a sense of their stances. A handful were firmly against Ms. Barnett's proposal, especially those who worked nights or had large families. Several others shrugged and said, "What can you do? She always gets her way." One evening, while walking my dog, I saw a woman about my age outside a neat, white colonial house. She was watering her flowers, and as I passed, she gave me a friendly nod. I recognized her as the woman who'd been peering from her porch on the day I moved in. "Hey," I said, "beautiful flowers." She smiled and turned off her hose. "Thanks. They're lilacs. I'm Monica. I live here with my mom." We made small talk for a minute. How long she'd lived there, all her life, how I was settling in, still adjusting. Eventually, the conversation drifted to the HOA. I confided in her about Ms. Barnett's new rule. Monica sighed and shook her head. "Trust me, she's been like this for years." The other day, she complained that my mother's handrails were too bright because we used a glossy paint instead of a matte finish. She's always finding some reason to nitpick. I exhaled in frustration. I was trying to be respectful by using solar lights, but I guess that's not enough. Monica's eyes lit up. "Solar? And she's complaining about wasting electricity? That's absurd." "Right," I said, shaking my head. "But the vote's coming up next week, and with the board members in her pocket, I'm not sure how I can fight it." She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Maybe you should gather support from the neighbors who oppose it. She likes to act like she speaks for everyone, but plenty of us are fed up with her micromanagement. You'd be surprised how many people will back you if you confront her with a good plan." It was encouraging to hear. I thanked Monica for her advice and made a mental note to talk to more people in the coming days. Perhaps Ms. Barnett's stranglehold on the neighborhood wasn't as unbreakable as it seemed. The days leading up to the HOA vote were tense. A quiet rebellion simmered in the community. I found that parents of young children, people who worked shifts, and some older folks who wanted to keep a porch light on for security were all in my corner. I also discovered that Ms. Barnett's biggest advantage was fear. Everyone worried that if they opposed her openly, she'd find some obscure bylaw to fine them. She'd done it before, handing out notices for weed encroachment, fence paint chipping, or unauthorized yard decor. She was relentless. Determined to stand my ground, I drafted a petition asking the HOA board to reject the 8 p.m. shutoff proposal. I wrote a short, clear statement. "This new rule is unnecessary, does not significantly reduce the neighborhood's carbon footprint, and poses safety hazards. Furthermore, it infringes on personal property rights by preventing harmless, solar-powered illumination." Monica was the first to sign, followed by Carlos. Word spread, and within a few days, I had gathered over 30 signatures. Some people signed eagerly, others whispered conspiratorially, like we were forming some secret resistance to a tyrant. The evening before the vote, I sat on my porch, looking over the petition. The front lights glowed softly around me, and I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. Maybe this could work. Maybe we could stop Ms. Barnett's crusade. As I was sitting there, I noticed Ms. Barnett's car slowing in front of my house. She rolled down the passenger window, her stern eyes glaring from the driver's seat. Then, in a sweep of red brake lights, she drove off into the dusk. I had a sinking feeling in my gut. Something told me she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Wednesday evening arrived. The clubhouse was packed. The air buzzed with anticipation, mingled with an undertone of anxiety. The motion on the table, outdoor light shutoff at 8 p.m., introduced by Ms. Barnett under the banner of energy conservation and light pollution reduction. She began by summarizing her case, an impassioned speech that included everything from moral responsibility to vague references to climate change. She deftly ignored the fact that solar lights don't draw electricity from the grid. When she finished, her expression was smug, as though certain she had made an unassailable argument. I stood to address the room. My heart pounded, but the supportive gazes of Monica, Carlos, and others emboldened me. Neighbors, I began, clearing my throat. I agree that environmental concerns are important, but this proposed rule is misguided. In many cases, including my own, the lighting is solar-powered, thus eliminating the electricity usage Ms. Barnett is so concerned about. Moreover, turning all lights off after 8 p.m. is a safety risk for those who come home late or walk their pets in the evening. A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. I held up the petition. I have here over 30 signatures from homeowners who believe this rule is unnecessary. We do want an eco-friendly neighborhood. Of course we do, but let's pursue measures that make sense. We can encourage solar lighting. We can limit overly bright, grid-powered illumination. But a blanket 8 p.m. shutoff punishes everyone, including those of us who aren't wasting electricity at all. Several people clapped. Ms. Barnett's lips thinned, and she took the lectern again. While I appreciate the passion of Mr. Merrick, she said coolly, I must remind everyone that I, too, have gathered support for my proposal. A handful of neighbors nodded reluctantly, though it was clear they feared her more than they agreed with her. The board members, who rarely contradicted her, looked uneasy. The time came to vote. The board members cast their ballots first. Predictably, the two under Ms. Barnett's influence approved the measure. One independent board member voted against it. So, the count was 2-1 in favor. The measure then went to the general membership. The result, after counting raised hands, was close. Very close. As the tallies were announced, Ms. Barnett's expression flickered between triumph and annoyance. In the end, the measure passed, barely, by a single vote. A hush fell over the room. I felt a rush of disappointment. So did many around me. Ms. Barnett quickly took the microphone, presumably to finalize the rule, but I raised my hand before she could speak. I'd like to point out that, as per the HOA's bylaws, there is a 60-day grace period before any new regulation is enforced, I said, referencing a line I'd come across in the rulebook. Which means we have some time to come up with an alternative or a compromise if the board is open to it. Ms. Barnett's eyes narrowed. We'll discuss it in next month's meeting, she said sharply. Without another word, she gave a perfunctory rap of the gavel, and the meeting adjourned. The crowd dispersed slowly, subdued. As I left, Monica patted my shoulder. We'll figure something out, Sam. Don't lose hope. But that night, all I felt was a heavy weight. I had tried to stand up to Karen. I had the signatures. Yet she managed to push her rule through. I woke the next morning to find a new letter in my mailbox, courtesy of Ms. Barnett. It was a formal notice that the 8 p.m. shutdown rule would be implemented in 60 days, urging me to take proactive steps to remove or disable any outdoor lighting that remains illuminated past the designated hour. My frustration simmered. I reread the letter, focusing on the phrase, any outdoor lighting that remains illuminated past the designated hour. Suddenly, a question surfaced. What if the lights weren't powered by electricity drawn from the local grid? What if they came on by themselves, entirely outside the usual definition of electrical usage that the HOA might regulate? Yes, I already had solar pathway lights, but they were traditional enough that Ms. Barnett might argue they still qualified as non-essential. If I wanted to circumvent her rule, I needed something more unconventional, something that would technically comply but still light up my path. That afternoon, I drove to a home improvement store in the neighboring town. There, in the lighting section, I found exactly what I needed: solar-powered LED ornaments designed to glow intermittently like fireflies. They had built-in sensors that caused them to flicker at night, resembling a cluster of dancing fireflies. They required no direct plug-in, no wiring, just sunlight during the day to charge. Once dusk fell, they shone softly, purely from stored solar energy. If Ms. Barnett's entire argument was that I was wasting electricity, these little ornaments would be the perfect solution. They weren't your normal constant beam solar stakes. They were whimsical, flickering strings of lights that you could hang on small stakes or weave around a garden. Technically, if she read the letter of the new rule, it focused on outdoor lighting drawing on external power after 8 p.m. But was that the only interpretation? I carefully reread the newly passed rule. It indeed stated that non-essential outdoor fixtures that draw power from the electrical grid shall be disabled or turned off after 8 p.m. Solar or battery-powered devices were never explicitly mentioned. She'd lumped them all together in conversation, but the official text singled out lights connected to the grid. Excitement bubbled in my chest. I loaded up on several boxes of these firefly lights, enough to line my entire walkway, and I sent a few garden posts as well. It was more than I originally planned, but I had a point to make. For the next few weeks, I quietly prepared my firefly installation. During the day, the devices soaked up sunlight, their tiny internal batteries charging. They remained completely dormant, inconspicuous. I didn't go out of my way to hide it from Ms. Barnett or any passersby. Anyone who happened to walk by my house during the day might have noticed curious little orbs, hardly larger than silver dollar coins, nestled around my yard. But no one said a thing. Then came the first night I'd fully set them up. The sun sank below the horizon in a blaze of oranges and pinks, and the sky transitioned to purple twilight. At precisely 8 p.m., any normal electric lights would be required to shut off under the new rule. But my yard looked nearly dark. No typical garden stakes, no porch bulbs blazing. I stood by my front window, waiting. Then, around 8:15, the first flickers appeared. Soft glows sparked to life, dim at first, then brightening into clusters. More and more flickers joined in, until my entire walkway looked like a gathering of friendly fireflies. It was gentle, enchanting, and best of all, entirely solar. People on evening walks paused at my fence. I heard someone exclaim, "Wow, is that? Are those real fireflies?" Another person said, "No, they're lights. But oh my gosh, they look amazing." I felt a little giddy. I wasn't breaking any rules, at least not as written, and yet my path was beautifully illuminated, all without drawing a single watt from the grid. I couldn't wait for Ms. Barnett, Karen, to see it. It didn't take long for Ms. Barnett to respond. The very next morning, I found a note taped to my door. Notice of violation. It has come to our attention that your property is employing outdoor lighting after 8 p.m. in apparent conflict with the newly adopted energy conservation rule. You are hereby required to remove any non-essential lighting or face the appropriate penalties and fines. Lakecrest Heights HOA. President Miriam Barnett. I read it twice, my annoyance building. She was acting as if the rule had no exceptions. But I knew the text by heart. The rule specifically targeted lighting drawing from the grid. I decided to reply formally. Drafting a letter, I carefully cited the exact language. Non-essential outdoor fixtures that draw power from the electrical grid. Then I stated that my lights were solar-powered, not connected to any external electricity source. Therefore, they did not violate the rule's wording. I ended politely but firmly, requesting that the notice of violation be revoked. A day later, an email from Ms. Barnett arrived in my inbox. No courtesy phone call or in-person visit this time. Subject: Solar lights. While you are correct that the letter of the rule mentions fixtures that draw power from the electrical grid, the spirit of the rule clearly intended to prohibit any outdoor lighting that remains lit past 8 p.m. We will discuss next steps at the upcoming board meeting. Regards, Miriam Barnett. The spirit of the rule, I muttered angrily. She was trying to bend the language in her favor. But the measure had passed in an official capacity, and the text was all we had to go by. I was about to close my laptop when a new message popped up. This one from one of the board members, an older gentleman named Mr. Dempsey, who'd voted in favor of Ms. Barnett's rule, but was known to be more moderate. "Sam, I'd like to speak with you before the next meeting. Ms. Barnett is quite upset, but there may be a solution that satisfies both parties. Let's chat. Best, George Dempsey." I glanced at the email, torn between hope and suspicion. Maybe, just maybe, the HOA board realized that Ms. Barnett's stance was overreaching. I met with Mr. Dempsey at the local coffee shop. He seemed genuinely sympathetic, sipping his cappuccino as I outlined my perspective again. "You understand," he said, "that the rule was meant to curb excessive lighting. Ms. Barnett is worried your yard sets a precedent for ignoring curfews." I couldn't help but chuckle. "But it's not excessive at all. They're gentle, flickering lights. People love them." He nodded. "I've heard good feedback from some neighbors. Even so, Ms. Barnett is concerned that your yard remains illuminated. Technically," I pointed out, "the rule does not apply to solar lights." Mr. Dempsey set his cup down. "That's the sticking point. The language is indeed specific about grid usage. But if the board sides with you on that interpretation, Ms. Barnett may push for an amendment to include all lighting. My stomach sank. So she's planning to escalate this? He shrugged. She has that power, but she'll need the board's approval, and we've seen how the neighborhood feels. I think she's losing popularity. All these additional restrictions are wearing people out. We talked for nearly an hour, brainstorming ideas. One possibility was to propose an official exemption for solar or battery-powered lighting, clearly codifying that it was allowed. That would keep Ms. Barnett from targeting me specifically, but it might require a formal vote, something she could obstruct. In the end, Mr. Dempsey promised to help me navigate the process. If we couldn't overturn the new rule entirely, maybe we could pass an amendment clarifying an exception for solar lights. As the next HOA meeting approached, tensions in Lakecrest Heights reached an all-time high. My walkway had become a mini attraction. People strolled by in the evenings just to watch the gentle, flickering lights that gave the illusion of fireflies dancing in the grass. Some neighbors openly praised me for outsmarting Ms. Barnett's rule. Others worried that it would provoke her into creating even more draconian regulations. Still, the support was heartening. Meanwhile, I caught wind of Ms. Barnett's personal vendetta. Rumors circulated that she was combing the HOA manual for any minor infraction she could pin on me, perhaps something about the height of my hedges or the color of my mailbox numbers. So far, I'd kept everything to code, so she hadn't found anything to sink her teeth into. One afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find Ms. Barnett standing there in her usual crisp attire, lips pressed tight. "Sam," she said curtly, stepping inside without being invited. "We need to talk." I motioned to the living room, where she perched on the edge of a chair, taking in her surroundings with that critical stare. She got straight to the point. "I'm aware that you believe yourself to be in compliance with the lighting rule. And perhaps legally, you are. But you need to understand something. The spirit of this rule is to keep outdoor lights off after 8 p.m. It's what the community voted for." I folded my arms. "With all due respect, Ms. Barnett, the community voted for a rule about electricity usage, not for banning all lighting, including solar." She took a breath, obviously irritated. "I've spoken to residents who say your yard is a distraction, that it encourages children to wander outside in the dark. Someone could get hurt." My jaw tightened. She was really reaching now. I haven't heard a single complaint. And in any case, it's not a bright floodlight. It's a gentle glow. If anything, it makes it safer to walk by. Ms. Barnett stood, smoothing her blouse. "Mark my words, I will push for an amendment to this rule that bans any illumination after 8 p.m. unless it's a motion-activated security light. It's time the neighborhood realized we must prioritize real sustainability over vanity lighting." "Real sustainability?" I repeated. "They're solar lights, Ms. Barnett. Zero carbon footprint from the grid." Her eyes flashed. "I've said what I came to say. If you persist, be prepared for an official hearing." With that, she marched out of my house. My dog, startled from the confrontation, stared up at me quizzically. I rubbed his ears and muttered, "Guess we're not done fighting her yet, boy." News of Ms. Barnett's threats spread like wildfire. Many neighbors expressed concern that she might push for a total ban on any post-8 p.m. lighting. That was too extreme, even for some who had initially sided with her. Linda, the older woman with pink lipstick, organized a small meeting in her backyard. She invited neighbors who opposed Ms. Barnett's draconian approach to come discuss the next steps. Over lemonade and cookies, we hatched a plan to counter her probable amendment. "We need to show how many of us think the solar lights are an excellent alternative," Linda declared. "If we make the meeting about the virtues of solar energy, Ms. Barnett will look unreasonable trying to ban it." Others chimed in with ideas. Some proposed a demonstration of various solar setups. Another neighbor, a retired teacher named Ms. Reyes, suggested we come armed with facts about how solar lights actually help the environment. "This isn't just about me or my yard," I emphasized. "If Ms. Barnett moves to ban all lighting, we'll lose the ability to choose how we safely light our property. Tonight, it's me. Tomorrow, she might enforce something new that hurts you." They nodded in agreement. It felt surreal, almost like we were planning a protest. But that was the level of control Ms. Barnett wielded, and we had to match her intensity with unity. The following week arrived, bringing yet another crowded HOA meeting. Word had gotten out that Ms. Barnett was going to propose a new, stricter bylaw. The entire neighborhood showed up. Even people who rarely attended came, curious about the unfolding drama. Ms. Barnett approached the lectern. She radiated confidence, or perhaps arrogance. Her voice rang out clearly. Ladies and gentlemen of Lakecrest Heights, I bring before you tonight an important amendment to the 8 p.m. lighting ordinance. In the interest of fairness and clarity, we propose that all outdoor lighting, regardless of power source, be shut off by 8 p.m., with the sole exception of security lighting that is both motion-sensitive and angled downwards. A collective gasp spread through the room. She pressed on. As you know, the original intention of this ordinance was to reduce energy waste and light pollution. Allowing solar-powered lights to remain on after 8 p.m. defeats the purpose by keeping properties illuminated. We believe in a uniform approach. Lights off means lights off. This is the best path to a truly eco-friendly community. She finished and looked around, daring anyone to disagree. Mr. Dempsey stood next. He cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Barnett, for stating your position. However, I'd like to open the floor to members who have input. A line immediately formed. Linda, Monica, Carlos, Ms. Reyes, and several others each took a turn at the microphone, voicing opposition to banning solar lights. They talked about safety, aesthetics, and, most importantly, the actual environmental benefits. I was last in line. When I reached the microphone, I paused for a breath, scanning the audience. Ms. Barnett's gaze bored into me, her arms folded. Neighbors, I began, I respect the desire to be eco-friendly, but this new amendment doesn't promote sustainability. It punishes those of us who have chosen solar technology, a solution that requires no electricity from the grid, thus not adding to Lakecrest Heights' carbon footprint. In fact, it may even lower it if more people switch to solar. I turned toward Ms. Barnett. We should encourage solar lighting, not ban it. If the goal is truly to reduce energy usage, we have done that. If the goal is to reduce light pollution, we can pass guidelines about brightness levels or hours of operation. But banning all lighting outright, even solar, is excessive. It's an infringement on personal freedom and doesn't serve the environment at all. The room erupted in applause. Ms. Barnett's face looked pinched, and a few in the front row glanced at her nervously. Mr. Dempsey collected himself. The board will take a vote on the proposed amendment. But before that, let's have a show of hands. How many are in favor of Ms. Barnett's complete ban on post-8 p.m. lighting, including solar? A smattering of hands went up, less than at the previous meeting, I noted. Then, Mr. Dempsey asked how many opposed the amendment. This time, nearly the entire room rose in opposition, a wave of arms in the air. Ms. Barnett's expression hardened. She knew she'd lost. The board members took their official vote. 2 abstained, 1 voted for the amendment, clearly loyal to Ms. Barnett, and 2 voted against. The amendment did not pass. Exhilaration rippled through me. We had just beaten Ms. Barnett in a fair vote, thanks to the neighbors who rallied together. Ms. Barnett offered no gracious concession. She simply scowled, tapped her gavel, and closed the meeting in terse, clipped words. In the days following our victory, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. More people began experimenting with solar lights. Monica put up some delicate hanging lanterns on her porch. Carlos replaced a couple of bulb fixtures with solar-powered sconces. Linda got a set of whimsical, color-changing stakes by her roses. The synergy was exciting. What started as my attempt to comply with Ms. Barnett's rule while maintaining a safe, lit walkway was turning into a mini-solar revolution in Lakecrest Heights. Meanwhile, Ms. Barnett's resentment simmered. She drove through the neighborhood in her sedan, scrutinizing yards. She filed petty complaints about overgrown shrubs or slightly crooked mailboxes. It was as though she couldn't stand the fact that she'd been bested. One afternoon, Monica knocked on my door, looking worried. "Sam, I just got a notice that my garden fence is half an inch too tall according to some obscure bylaw," she said, exasperated. "I've had that fence for 2 years, and no one said a word." I gritted my teeth. She's retaliating. That's all it is. Monica nodded. We need to stick together. If she tries to pick us off one by one with these minor infractions, we should unite and defend each other. And that's exactly what happened. Every time someone received a petty complaint, the rest of us pitched in, helping them correct the issue if it was legitimate or gather evidence if Ms. Barnett was misreading the rules. We shared tips and invited each other to watch out for unannounced inspections. Over time, Ms. Barnett's tactics began to lose their power. Despite the ongoing hostilities, something unexpected happened. Late one evening, I was coming home from a friend's place. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Ms. Barnett's car parked oddly in front of her home across the street. The driver's side door was open, and she was kneeling on the ground. Concerned, I jogged over and found her wrestling with a flat tire. She looked up, eyes reflecting surprise, maybe even embarrassment. "What do you want?" she snapped, though she was clearly struggling. I knelt beside her. "Need a hand." She paused, huffing. "I've got it under control." Her wheel iron slipped, and she nearly lost her balance. With a sigh, she relented. "All right, fine. If you want to help, I won't say no." I retrieved my own jack from the trunk, and we got to work. Changing the tire took only a few minutes. At first, Ms. Barnett was silent, her eyes darting away from mine. Gradually, though, she started to relax. "Thank you," she said quietly when we finished. I appreciate it." I offered a small smile. "Anytime." For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. She seemed about to say something else, but instead she said, "You have a good night," then walked briskly into her house. It wasn't much, but it was the first time she'd allowed me, or anyone, it seemed, to see her in a moment of weakness. It made me wonder about the person behind the authoritarian facade. In the following weeks, Ms. Barnett eased off her campaign of fines and violations, if only a little. I noticed she was less visible around the neighborhood, absent from her usual evening patrols. One morning, Linda approached me with a piece of gossip. I heard Ms. Barnett might be stepping down from the HOA presidency soon. "Really?" I said, surprised. "Did she announce that?" "Not officially, but a couple board members hinted that she's worn out from the constant battles. And get this, her sister has been ill, so she might need to move closer to family." I felt a pang of sympathy, remembering that moment by her car. "I didn't realize she was dealing with that," I murmured. Linda shrugged. "She doesn't let people in much, and she's never exactly been a beacon of warmth." Still, the news sent ripples of relief through some folks, who hoped the HOA might adopt a more balanced approach if Ms. Barnett stepped down. But nothing was confirmed yet. Just when it seemed like things might calm down, a new controversy arose. The local power company proposed a small solar farm project outside our suburb, and they wanted to place some of the panels near Lakecrest Heights' outer boundary. Some neighbors were excited about the prospect of sustainable energy. Others worried it would be an eyesore or reduce property values. Ms. Barnett, surprisingly, was vocally against the solar farm. "It will ruin the quaint appearance of our community," she proclaimed in an email blast. "We'll be surrounded by reflective panels." The hypocrisy wasn't lost on anyone. She had used the argument of environmentalism to clamp down on lighting, yet she was vehemently opposing a solar initiative. This only fueled the sentiment that Ms. Barnett wasn't truly driven by eco-friendly goals. She simply wanted control. The board scheduled another meeting to discuss whether the HOA would issue a statement of support or opposition to the solar farm. Once again, Ms. Barnett and I found ourselves on opposite sides of the debate. This time, though, the tide had shifted. Many neighbors who used to follow Ms. Barnett's lead had grown weary of her contradictory stances. They also appreciated the convenience and cost savings of solar. After all, our small solar lights revolution had opened their eyes to new possibilities. Despite Ms. Barnett's loud protests, the board voted to issue a neutral to positive statement about the solar farm. They recognized that many homeowners saw benefits in sustainable energy and that the farm was a couple miles from the main residential area, so it wouldn't be an eyesore, as she claimed. I watched her reaction carefully. Rather than fuming with anger, she seemed drained, almost resigned. She left the meeting without her usual dramatics. A week later, I came home to a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Sam, we've had our differences, but I need to ask you a favor. Could you come by my house tomorrow around noon? There's something important I must discuss. Miriam Barnett." I blinked, rereading the note. Why on earth was she reaching out to me? We were practically enemies in the HOA war. Still, the request was strangely polite. Curiosity got the better of me. The next day, I rang Ms. Barnett's doorbell. She answered in casual clothes, not the crisp attire I was used to seeing, and her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail. She gestured for me to follow her into the living room. I noticed the house was immaculate, yet there were stacks of paperwork and pamphlets about senior care, as well as real estate brochures for neighborhoods in another state. She cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. Thank you for coming, Sam. I'll get straight to the point. She hesitated, then spoke in a subdued tone. My sister is very ill, and she lives alone in Arizona. I might have to move there to take care of her. I frowned. I'm sorry to hear that. But how can I help? She brushed a tear from the corner of her eye. I realize that if I leave Lakecrest Heights, I'll need to resign from the HOA board. But before that happens, I want to find someone reliable who cares about this community to step in. Someone who can keep it from falling apart. Surprise washed over me. And you're asking me? She nodded, gaze dropping to her hands. You've shown a lot of tenacity. You challenged me on the lighting rule, yet you also went out of your way to help me when my tire was flat. I took a moment to process this. The idea of me leading any part of the HOA seemed laughable, but maybe that was exactly what the neighborhood needed, a voice of reason to ensure fair guidelines. I'm honored, I said slowly, but are you sure? She attempted a small smile. You're dedicated and fair-minded. The neighbors respect you, and despite our disagreements, I think you genuinely want what's best for Lakecrest Heights. A part of me was still reeling from this turnaround, but another part felt a surge of compassion for Ms. Barnett. She was dealing with a personal crisis, and maybe she realized there were bigger things in life than micromanaging her neighbors. I'll need to think about it, I told her honestly. She nodded. I understand. Please let me know soon. That night, I tossed and turned, debating whether to take on an HOA leadership role. Did I really want to get entangled in all that bureaucracy? Could I handle the pressure, the constant scrutiny? Would I do any better than Ms. Barnett? In the morning, I talked to Monica, Linda, Carlos, and a few others about the offer. Their reactions ranged from shock to excitement. This is our chance, Linda said enthusiastically. If you join the board, you can help restore some sanity. Carlos clapped me on the shoulder. I know it's a headache, but you'd be good at it. You actually listen. Ultimately, I decided to accept. My hope was that by stepping up, I could help shape a more reasonable, inclusive HOA, a group that truly represented the neighbors instead of dominating them. I wrote a short letter to Ms. Barnett, confirming that I would be willing to fill her position should she move. She responded with a simple line, "Thank you. We'll make an announcement soon." 2 weeks later, Ms. Barnett called an HOA meeting, presumably her last. Everyone arrived, curious about the purpose. She stood at the lectern, looking more subdued than ever before. Fellow residents of Lakecrest Heights, she began, voice wavering slightly. It is with a heavy heart that I announce my resignation from the HOA presidency, effective immediately. A hush fell over the crowd. She explained, in clipped sentences, that her sister's health situation required her immediate presence elsewhere. Then, she surprised everyone by announcing that I, Sam Merrick, had agreed to run for the position in a special election. There was an outburst of murmuring. But once the shock wore off, Linda and Monica led a round of applause. One by one, people began clapping. Some even cheered. Ms. Barnett managed a taut smile. She gestured for me to come forward. I took the microphone, feeling my heart pound. Thank you, I said, voice trembling slightly. I'm honored to be considered for this. I care about Lakecrest Heights. My promise is to keep the good things we have while ensuring that rules are fair, respectful of personal freedom, and beneficial to the entire community. There were more cheers. Then, with an uncharacteristically gentle hand, Ms. Barnett patted my shoulder. "Take care of this place," she whispered, and stepped away from the podium. In the days that followed, Ms. Barnett quietly packed her belongings and listed her house for sale. A few neighbors visited her to drop off food or express sympathies about her sister. She politely thanked them, though she never truly softened into an affable neighbor. But the air of hostility that had once surrounded her seemed to fade. Meanwhile, the HOA held a formal vote on my appointment as president. With Ms. Barnett gone, I won by a landslide. I assembled a small committee that included Linda, Monica, and Mr. Dempsey to rewrite some of the more overbearing rules. The top priority was addressing the infamous 8 p.m. lights out law. We put forth a motion clarifying that solar and low-voltage LED lighting would be fully exempt, so long as they didn't exceed certain brightness limits. Traditional lighting would need to meet efficiency standards, but could remain on as needed until a more reasonable cutoff, such as 10 p.m. We also added a clause allowing for exceptions in cases of personal safety or special events. When we presented these reforms at a community gathering, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were grateful that they wouldn't be punished for wanting a safe, lit walkway or decorative lights for the holiday season. The new guidelines encouraged solar solutions instead of banning them outright. It felt surreal, remembering how the conflict had begun with Ms. Barnett's fervor for turning off lights at 8 p.m. Now, under new leadership, Lakecrest Heights embraced a more moderate, genuinely eco-friendly stance, one that didn't sacrifice safety or aesthetics. That summer, the neighborhood seemed to radiate a fresh sense of unity. Kids played in driveways, porch gatherings became more frequent, and people no longer lived under the fear that Ms. Barnett would swoop in to fine them for minor infractions. My walkway, still adorned with those solar firefly LEDs, became a symbol of the transformation. Neighbors loved strolling by in the evenings to watch them flicker. A few families added similar lights to their backyards, creating little pockets of shimmering wonder. The local newspaper even ran a small story about Lakecrest Heights' shift toward community-based leadership, highlighting the successful adoption of solar lighting as a model for other HOAs. It praised the neighborhood for balancing environmental concerns with practicality and neighborly goodwill. I found myself brimming with pride. I had never envisioned taking on such a role, but now I was helping shape a friendlier, fairer, and more sustainable community. One warm afternoon in late August, I received a letter postmarked from Arizona. The return address was Ms. Barnett's new residence. Inside was a short, handwritten note. Sam, I trust Lakecrest Heights is faring well under your guidance. My sister's condition is stable, and I am settling into life here. Though we were often at odds, I want you to know I always cared deeply about the neighborhood. My methods were strict, perhaps too strict, but I hope you continue to champion good stewardship of Lakecrest Heights. Thank you again for stepping in. Miriam. I read her words twice, feeling a wave of mixed emotions, surprise, respect, and even a touch of sadness. The note was a reminder that people's motivations can be complex. Ms. Barnett might have wielded power in abrasive ways, but at the root, she did want the community to thrive. I penned a polite reply, wishing her well and assuring her that Lakecrest Heights was on a positive path. I mentioned the new solar-friendly policies and how they were well received. I hoped that, in some small way, our compromise might validate at least part of her original intention to conserve energy, only without punishing everyone in the process. Time rolled on, and life in Lakecrest Heights settled into a comfortable rhythm. Under the revised rules, people enjoyed more freedom to express themselves through yard decor, provided it wasn't offensive or dangerously bright. Neighbors began to chat at the community garden, swap tools, and trade cuttings of favorite flowers. Monica's mother set up a small stand selling homemade lemonade and snacks during summer weekends. Carlos and a few volunteers painted a mural on the side of the community clubhouse, depicting the natural beauty of the lake near our neighborhood. Linda organized a monthly craft fair, inviting local artisans to show their wares. Through it all, the solar lights continued to glow each night, a gentle reminder of the struggle we had endured and the positive outcome we had achieved. No one had to kill their lights at 8 p.m. Instead, we simply enjoyed the evenings, guiding ourselves along softly lit walkways, hearing the crickets chirp and the breeze rustle through the maples. One late September evening, as I relaxed in my now comfortably furnished living room, I thought back on the entire journey. When I first moved here, I never expected to face such a dramatic clash of wills. Ms. Barnett, Karen, had loomed over everything, dictating rules, scowling at the slightest infringement. But her meddling, ironically, led to something beautiful. It rallied the neighborhood, forced us to communicate our needs, and spurred us to find creative, eco-friendly solutions. Without Ms. Barnett's draconian approach, I might never have discovered the magic of those solar firefly lights. Nor would I have connected so deeply with my neighbors, forging real friendships. The struggle taught me about compromise, about standing up for what's right, and about the fact that even the most obstinate person might have a hidden vulnerability or a genuine desire to do good. As fall gave way to the holiday season, Lakecrest Heights embraced a new tradition, the Festival of Lights, Solar Edition. Residents were encouraged to decorate their yards with solar-powered strings and ornaments. It was a whimsical spectacle after dusk, a neighborhood awash in gentle twinkling glows, from porch rafters to front yard bushes. Children laughed, running from one display to another, admiring how the lights flickered and danced. Adults chatted in small groups, sipping hot cocoa and marveling at the creativity. All of it was done with minimal energy consumption, in line with our official emphasis on sustainability. We invited local press to cover the festival, and they wrote a glowing review, calling Lakecrest Heights the greenest Christmas lights display in the county. The spirit was joyful, inclusive, and unifying. Everything the neighborhood had long desired, now realized in a fresh, collaborative way. By early spring the following year, we saw real benefits from the changes. Our HOA dues remained stable since we weren't bleeding money on frivolous fines and enforcement. People were more inclined to volunteer for community projects, knowing they wouldn't be micromanaged. Home values stayed strong, even rising, thanks to positive publicity about our balanced, eco-friendly lifestyle. One sunny afternoon, I was overseeing a community landscaping project near the entrance of Lakecrest Heights when a couple looking to buy a home strolled through. They commented, "We've heard great things about this place, how it's managed well, has friendly neighbors, and is environment conscious." I grinned. "We try to keep it that way. Welcome to Lakecrest Heights." To everyone's surprise, Ms. Barnett returned for a brief visit in the summer, driving her same sedan with out-of-state plates. Word spread quickly, and some neighbors watched warily from their windows, half expecting her to critique their lawns or measure the height of their mailbox posts. But she seemed subdued. I was trimming hedges in my front yard when she pulled up. She got out, wearing a simple blouse and slacks. No clipboard, no stern expression. "Hello, Sam," she said, her tone oddly gentle. "I'm just in town to finalize the sale of my house." "Welcome back," I replied, setting aside my pruning shears. "How's your sister?" "She's improving," Ms. Barnett said, relief evident in her eyes. "We're making arrangements for long-term care. I'm grateful to have the time to help her." She glanced around at my yard, taking in the solar firefly lights, the neatly trimmed lawn, the subtle wind chimes by my porch. I braced for a sarcastic remark, but she surprised me. "You've done a fine job here," she said, her gaze flickering with something akin to admiration. "The neighborhood looks good, peaceful." "Thank you," I replied softly. "We've tried to make it a welcoming place for everyone." She nodded, shifting on her feet. "I suppose that was always my goal, too," she admitted awkwardly. "I just went about it the wrong way." I smiled. "I'm sure your intentions were good at heart. Sometimes we learn from what doesn't work." Ms. Barnett exhaled, looking uncharacteristically emotional. "Well, I'd best be going. Goodbye, Sam. Thank you again." She walked back to her car, and I noticed her eyes flicking over the solar lights one last time, as if conceding the silent truth. I had outsmarted her rule, and in doing so, helped the community find a better path. Over time, the story of Lakecrest Heights became a local legend, a place where a rigid HOA president tried to turn off every light at 8 p.m., only to spark a wave of creativity and unity among the neighbors. People still talk about the day the firefly lights first appeared, how it inspired them to rethink their yards, and how, ironically, it brought everyone closer together. Ms. Barnett, Karen, moved on to care for her sister, and though she remained somewhat distant, her parting gestures and occasional letters showed that she had at least found a touch of humility and peace. The neighborhood, under more open-minded leadership, thrived. At night, gentle orbs shimmered along pathways, in gardens, hanging from porches. Rather than a forced blackout, we had a tranquil illumination that symbolized both our respect for the environment and our desire for a welcoming community. Looking back, I realized that what began as a nuisance turned into a journey of growth, cooperation, and better understanding. Living with a difficult neighbor had its challenges, power struggles, personal vendettas, and moments of pure exasperation. But in the end, Karen's extreme measures inadvertently led us to discover our capacity for unity and innovation. And that, perhaps, was the greatest triumph of all, that we, as neighbors, learned to stand by each other, championing a cause that blended practicality and beauty. My yard, with its solar-powered Firefly LEDs, became the shining example of outsmarting a draconian rule and ending up with something enchanting. And so the story ends happily. Our lights stayed on, soft, dancing, and completely off the electrical grid. The neighborhood flourished under its new spirit of compromise and kindness, proving that even the most obstinate Karen couldn't extinguish the warm glow of community when people came together for a better tomorrow.